Have you ever felt defeated? I felt defeated a few weeks ago. I decided to go for a run, and on this particular occasion, I decided to run 28 kilometers. You know, because I've got problems. So I went on a run, and I discovered the reason why some people say things like, when I run, I forget all my problems. I discovered that on this run, I forgot all my problems too, because I was so focused on one problem, that I had pain everywhere in my body, and that's the only thing I could focus on. You see, I'm no spring chicken anymore, and around the 17-kilometer mark is when my body began to fall apart. I stopped to stretch a couple times. I started slowing down, then I began the hobble, walk, limp, semi-jog, and finally I came to that moment, that awkward moment in the run, around the 24-kilometer mark, where I said, I just can't do it. I quit. And the most humiliating part of all was that I had to call Father Simon to come and pick me up in his car. I just couldn't do it. I felt defeated. Have you ever felt defeated? Have you ever felt like a failure? I think sometimes things in life can leave us feeling defeated, especially when it comes to challenges, sudden tragedies, challenges with our mental health in a particular way. As Father Simon mentioned at the beginning of Mass, we're in the last week of our preaching series on mental health called In Your Head. Because we know that our faith, that what Jesus came to teach us has something to say about even our mental health, that our faith is meant to be brought to bear on all aspects and dimensions of our faith. And so often, one of the places we experience defeat is in the realm or the sphere of our mental health. I want to preface this by saying, again, I'm not a medical professional, I'm not a psychologist, and so I'm speaking on this as a Catholic priest from the perspective of faith. And one of those places, again, when it comes to mental health, we can often find ourselves feeling defeated. And I want to read two examples of things that I read from the perspective of people who struggle in a particular way with mental illness. The first thing is from somebody who struggles with anxiety. And they wrote this. They said, anxiety feels like defeat. It feels like no matter what I do, I am stuck. I feel trapped in a perpetual moment of failure, where every thought and decision leads to more failure, defeat. This other one, written from the perspective of someone who struggles with depression, writes this: depression is more than just a feeling of sadness, loss, or anger. It is not these emotions. It is not feeling these emotions, It is the long battle to not feel. It is the exhaustion after the long battle. It is the helplessness we feel after we have lost the fight not to feel. Depression feels like defeat, they write. And even if you, in a particular way, don't struggle personally with mental illness, perhaps you've stood by and felt powerless while you watch somebody in your life that you love struggle with mental illness and were unable to do anything. Perhaps you feel defeated in those moments. And I think all of us from time to time, we struggle even with self-defeating thoughts. Right? This dimension of our mental health, the kind of self-talk. We say things to ourselves like, I'm a failure. Like, I'm not lovable. I'll never be good enough. And I give up. I quit. I'm done. I'm out. And so whoever you are, I hope you can kind of identify with this feeling of defeat. And yet, no matter how defeated we might feel at times, our faith has something different to say to us, particularly in those moments of defeat. And so what does our faith have to say to us in these moments? Well, I want to step back for a moment. And I want to ask the question, what is defeat? In the ultimate analysis, what does defeat mean other than to be separated from the love of God? Think about that for a second. Heaven and hell, what is heaven? But the place where we eternally experience the presence, where we're eternally joined to the love of God. And what is hell? But the place where we're eternally separated from the love of God. And so defeat ultimately is to be separated from the love of God. And I think we feel that existentially. We feel that in those moments of defeat, and they often come when we're suffering, when we're in some kind of physical pain, emotional pain, mental pain, when we're undergoing some serious trial or difficulty, we feel as if God is not present. We feel as though God's love is separated from us. We feel as if these things that we struggle with are almost like an obstacle or a barrier that prevent God's love from getting through. It's kind of like, like as if God's love is rain coming down on the earth. And our struggles, our trials, our sickness, our illness is that obstacle, the umbrella that prevents his love from reaching us. But that's not true, is it? We see that in the second reading from St. Paul. And St. Paul, the apostle, he's writing to the early church in the city of Rome. And he asks this question. He says, who will separate us from the love of God? Who will separate us from the love of God? And then he goes on to list a number of things. Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or the sword? Will your sleepless nights or your anxiety attacks, will your grief or tragedy, will your PTSD or your OCD, will coronavirus or cancer separate you from the love of God? Well, will it? Paul says no. No. He says, no, in all these things. Say that. All these things. Type that out. Type, in all these things. Type that right now into the comments, into the chat. In all these things, he says. What things? In all these things. What things? What things? Well, some things? No, in all these things, in failure, in unexpected job loss, in mental illness, in tragedy, in panic attacks, in unexpected sickness, in getting dumped, in all these things, St. Paul says, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. More than conquerors in all these things. Now, what does St. Paul mean by that? We are conquerors in these things. Well, here's what Paul is not saying. St. Paul is not saying that somehow your suffering, somehow mental illness, somehow your challenges with mental health, somehow the loss of a loved one, somehow grief, somehow pain, somehow trial, they're somehow going to go away or suddenly become painless. That is not what Paul is saying. I mean, they could because we worship the God of miracles. But what Paul is saying is that in none of these trials, nothing can separate us from the love of God. That God's love is present to us even in the midst of these things which feel like they separate us. You see, we are more than conquerors because the love of God, who created us for himself, because God could not bear to be separated from us, and so sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to follow us even into death, so that death itself could not separate us from the love of God. And that is a love that conquers all things. And that is the love that makes us conquerors in all these things. Now, just as an aside, just to put this into context, Paul in elsewhere does say there is one thing that can separate us from the love of God, and it's the only thing that can separate us from the love of God, is our own free will, our own free rejection of that love. Serious sin, mortal sin. And if any of you are watching this right now and you're struggling with a serious sin that's hanging over your head or over your life, or you're struggling with something, make an appointment and come speak to me, and we can work through that together. Now, here's the thing, though. Mental illness is not a sin. Suffering is not a sin. Pain is not a sin. And so none of these things can separate us from the love of God. Paul goes on and he says this. He says, I am convinced. I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. Nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. No power, nothing, nada, zero, zip, zilch. Nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, except for sin. Now, even though you may feel defeated, even though you may be going through some present darkness, some trials, some difficulty, and right now you feel like you're ready to give up, you feel defeated, I want you to know that God's love is undefeated, and that we are more than conquerors through Christ who loves us. But if you're feeling defeat, if you're feeling the temptation to quit, the temptation to give up, if you're struggling with self-defeating thoughts, if something in your life is making you feel as if you're defeated, what can we do as Christian believers? What can we do? This is what I want you to do. I want you to go out and run 28 kilometers. Okay, if you can't do that, do this instead. The next time you say to yourself, I am a failure. The next time you say, I'll never be good enough. The next time you find yourself thinking, I'm not lovable, no one accepts me, I'm not worthy of being loved. The next time you say, I give up, I want you to cling to that passage. I want you to say that passage that we just read. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through Christ who loved me. Next time you say, you're tempted to say, I am a failure. You say, I am not a failure. I am a conqueror through Christ who loved me. Next time you're tempted to say, I'll never be good enough, you say, I am good enough because I am more than a conqueror through Christ who loved me. If you're tempted to say, I'm not lovable, you say, I am lovable. I am loved. I am a conqueror through Christ who loved me. And if you're tempted to quit, you're tempted to give up, to despair, you say, no, I will never give up because I am more than a conqueror through Christ who loved me. And so we cling in these moments of darkness to the truth of who we are and who Jesus is and the love of God that is undefeated. And I want to tell you now a story about somebody who's a conqueror, someone in whom the love of God was undefeated. His name was Mark G. Qiansheng. And Mark G. was born in the year 1834 in China. And Mark G., he was a doctor, and he treated the poor for free. He's very generous. In his mid-30s, he developed a stomach ailment that caused intense pain, intense mental, physical anguish. And so he began treating it, as many people did at the time, with a pain medication, opium. But then Mark G., he became addicted to opium. And for 30 years of his life, Mark G. was addicted to opium. But he never gave up. He never stopped fighting. He would go to church and go to confession, and eventually at the time, the priests who didn't know enough about the psychological and physiological dimensions of addiction. They just interpreted his incapacity to quit opium as a refusal to change his life. And so eventually, even members of the church rejected Mark G. And he was refused the sacraments for years and years and years of his life. But that never stopped him from going. It never stopped him from clinging to the promise of God that in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. In the year 1900, at the turn of the century, the Boxer Rebellion spread across China. And it was this political movement to eliminate the influence of foreign power in China, including Christianity. And on July 7th, 1900, Mark G. was rounded up along with his son, his 2 daughters-in-law, and 6 of his grandchildren. And he was brought before a tribunal, and he was told if he didn't renounce his faith, he would be executed. But Mark G., he didn't give up. He was undefeated. And he clung to his faith, and he was put on trial, and he was declared guilty. And he begged his captors. This is how courageous Mark G. was. He begged his captors that he would be put to death last so that none of his loved ones would have to die alone. And then Mark G., as he was led to his execution, sang hymns of prayer and praise to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And then he was executed in witness to his faith. Now, Mark G. later was recognized by the church. This man who was separated from the sacramental life of the church for years and years and years and years leading up to his death, this man who struggled with the reality and the shame and the pain of an addiction to opium, the church recognized in this man holiness and declared him a saint. Because despite the affliction and the pain of his stomach, despite his addiction to opium, despite even death itself, in all these things, Mark G. was more than a conqueror through Christ who loved him. And now, St. Mark, he lives in that place beyond all pain, beyond all sadness, beyond all grief, beyond all suffering. In all of his pain, his addiction, his rejection, his physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological suffering, all of that pain is transformed into glory. And that same power that made St. Mark G. a saint, that same power that made him a conqueror over everything that sought to oppress him, that same power lives in you. Because we are more than conquerors through Christ who loved us. And the love of God is undefeated.